All right, so in this video, we are going to talk about Boolean expressions and then how they can be used in what are called conditional statements. So conditional statements, if you're thinking like, what on earth are you talking about, Ms. Wardecki? For those of you that have done programming before, conditional statements are essentially those if, else statements that we use commonly to make decisions and check for specific conditions in programming. So they're called conditional statements because of those decisions that are being made. So we're going to talk about conditionals, how they look in C# and monogame, and then you'll be moving forward and we'll be doing a program together after this lesson. So just to refresh your memories, there are a couple of different statements that you will see. First is the if statement. So you can see the flowchart off to the side. Basically, in an if statement, you are just checking in. If it's just an if by itself, you're coming in, you're checking this condition, this Boolean statement, whatever it is. If it's true, you're going to run some piece of code. And if it's false, you're just going to skip that piece of code and move on to the next action. So if statement says check if this is true, do this. If not, skip it and move on to the next statement afterwards. So what this will look like in your code is in C# you will see if. You will have some Boolean condition in here. So for example, maybe it'll say 3 times x equals time. So maybe you're checking to see if 3 times your x is equal to time. If that is the case, if that condition is true, it will run all of the actions inside of here. And if it's false, it will skip all of those actions and jump below and kind of just skip through it and ignore it altogether. Something to note in C#, if you haven't programmed in C++ or Java before, they use brackets to distinguish between what is inside that if statement and what actions should be run. So you will need to use brackets every time you're using conditional. So I should see if, then I should see your Boolean statement, and right after that I should see brackets around all of the instructions that you want to happen if this if statement is true. So keep that in mind as we move forward. That is the structure of C#. You will need to use these brackets as you program in C# and you use conditionals. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to check these 6 lines of code. So for those of you that have programmed before, I think you'll be able to catch those lines of code that are valid and those lines of code that are not. So on the left-hand side, you see 4 lines of code for conditionals, and you're checking basically those Boolean statements. So you're checking inside of each if to see if that statement is something that would evaluate to be true or false. So go through 1 through 4, decide whether those Boolean statements inside the conditional will evaluate to be true or false. Then on the right-hand side, what I would like you to check is whether or not the code is correct. So that's an entire conditional statement. Is that code written in a way that would run in C#? So use your knowledge. You don't need to check whether it's true or false and what would happen, but all I want you to tell me is that statement something valid that would work in C# and be able to explain why or why not. All right, so use this time to check your answers, see how you did. A couple of key things I want to hit on before you move on in C#. First, a couple of things I want you to note is that at the end of a conditional statement, you do not need to include a semicolon. So you'll notice here that none of these included semicolons right after the if. You don't need a semicolon here because it's going to continue on to the next line, and that's going to be still the same statement because you're saying if this is going on, continue to the next line and you're going to do this. Like, it's not a full statement. Nothing is really happening as a result of that statement. It's just saying check this condition and then follow the instructions after. So you do not need a semicolon after your if and your Boolean statement. Then from there, the reason number 2 is not okay is that this statement right here, x plus y plus z. Well, x and y and z are just integers, so that can't evaluate to be true or false. That will just be some numeric value, and as a result, that if statement wouldn't know whether or not to run. It doesn't say anything like if x is greater than y, something that can be true or false. X plus y is 1 plus z is 3. So it's just saying if 3. And that's not a statement that can be evaluated to be true or false. So number 2 would be an invalid line of code. Then looking at number 3, remember we talked about that single equal sign is assignment. That single equal sign is not checking equality. So in order for this to be true, we would need 2 equal signs in there. If we want to check for equality, we need to contain 2 equal signs. And I will tell you in advance, this is one of the most common errors I see as students begin programming in C#. They continue to forget that the double equal sign is how you check for equality. So number 3, you need to have a double equal sign if you're checking if things are equal. Then the last thing I want to touch on in number 6 is that, remember, the end of every line that is a statement where something is happening needs to contain a semicolon. So even though we don't need one at the end of our conditionals, at the end of if blank, all of the actions, every action needs to have a semicolon at the end. So make sure not to forget that piece as you start coding. Every action has a semicolon at the end. The conditional part, the if blank, is not an actual action, so it doesn't need a semicolon. But those actions inside of your conditionals do need a semicolon after their statement because action is actually occurring within your program. All right, so the second type of statement you'll see is called an if-else. So basically, this is great for when you have something that is true or false. So it's saying, okay, if this action occurs, you want one of 2 things to happen. If this condition is true, you're going to run this code. If this condition is false, you're going to run this code. And then these 2 are going to regroup at the bottom and continue going. So this part here, this if-else, is excellent if you want one of 2 pieces of code to run. It'll say, if this is true, run this. Otherwise, run this piece of code. So you can see that taking place here. This is an example of an if-else structure in C#. So it's saying, okay, if this statement right here, if this is true, then run this code. However, if that statement is false, if it's anything else but true, which is false, run this code. So this allows you to run 2 different pieces of code based on a decision. So if you have 2 different pieces of code that you would like to run based on a decision, you want it to run this for true and this for false for a Boolean statement, an if-else conditional is a great concept to be used. Finally, you can use the concept of if, else if, else if, else if, forever and ever if you have more than 2 possibilities. So if you have 4 different statements you want to, or 4 different pieces of code you want to run. You want this to run if their score is greater than a 5, and this to run if their score is between a 4 and a 5, and this to run if their score is between a 3 and a 4. If you have different possibilities, you want to use what's called an if, else, etc. concept. So that's what we'll be looking at next. One of the biggest things to remember, however, is that your program, if you have an if, else, will, once it finds its first condition or the first Boolean statement that's true, it will run that code and then skip the remainder of the conditional. And I'll explain what I mean in just a second when we see an example in real life code. So this is what this looks like in general, and you can include as many else ifs, as you'd like. So you can see here, okay, if this is our first Boolean statement, if this occurs to be true, run this code. But if that's not true, I want you to keep checking, and if this happens to be true, run this code. However, if those first 2 aren't true, keep going. If this is true, then you'll run this code, and you'll keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going. And if you ultimately don't find anything to be true, this else is what occurs if nothing else is true. So you actually don't need to include an else. You can have a list of if, else if, else if, else if, else if, else if. But if you want a section of code that will run simply because everything else was not true, then an else is a great way to go. So remember that you have a lot of options when dealing with conditionals, and you need to choose which one is most appropriate for your needs and for the problem you're trying to solve in your program. All right, so I do want to kind of walk you through what I meant on the previous page when I talked about how your code will essentially run the first piece of code that it finds to be true and then skip to the end of the program. So I have some data over here. I want to run this program a couple of different times and see what will print out based on the data that I've been given concerning R. So I'm going to make another little column here. I'm going to call this print. And I want to walk through what happens in each situation. So in this first situation, r is equal to 75. So what your computer will do, we'll call that number 1. What your computer will do is it will start at the very, very top, and it will check and be like, is r greater than 80? No. So it keeps going. Is r greater than 70? Yes. So it knows that this is going to be true, and as a result, it's going to follow the instruction here and print C to the screen. And then what's going to happen is your computer says, oh, I found something that's already true. Going to jump all the way down to here, and I'm going to continue running the code. So it skips the whole rest of it. It doesn't check anything else. And it says, I found the first thing that was true. I'm going to skip to the bottom, and I'm going to keep running the code that's after the conditional. So there's our first example. Then let's go to a different color. I'll use green this time. And we'll run it through with 55. So here we come through and we say, okay, we're starting at the top of the conditional. I'm not greater than 80, keep going. I'm not greater than 70, keep going. I'm not greater than 90, keep going. Oh, I'm out of options, and this is something that did not meet anything else, so I'm going to print the needs improvement to the screen. And then I'm going to jump in after that code and keep running. All right, so now let's look at 94. So actually, let's choose a different color. Let's choose blue. So here, I start the code. Oh, if I'm greater than 80, yes. 94 is greater than 80. So I'm going to run this code right here. It says to print a B to the screen. Then I'm going to skip down to the bottom, and I'm going to run the code after. So this is the biggest glitch, and this is actually the example I wanted to show you, is that your computer does not look for the best case. So if you look carefully here, the best choice would have been r is greater than 90 and to print A. However, your computer is not smart enough to print the best choice. Your computer finds the first condition that is true in that large conditional statement. So it looks for the first thing. So you actually need to be very purposeful when you create your conditionals, because it finds the first thing that is true. It doesn't look at all possibilities and say, this is the best choice. So in the case of this program, this person's program wouldn't work as expected. If we wanted to fix this, this would actually need to be our first statement up here to make sure that r is greater than 90 caught that A part first, caught that the 94 was greater than 90. So you have to be very, very purposeful with your conditionals and make sure that the order in which you're writing your conditionals is prepared to catch all situations. So be very, very careful. Don't just write your else if really, really quickly. Be purposeful about how you structure them so that they work as expected. Now, if you try these last two here, I'm not going to trace them all the way through, but if you bring r is greater than 82, that one will also print B, and r is equal to 10, that will also print needs improvement. So just be prepared. I will ask you to trace various values through a conditional, and I'll ask you to tell me what they're going to print, just to emphasize the point that your conditionals need to be purposefully created. So at this point, you've reached the end of lesson 5 concept videos. You can move on to the programming video, and then from there you can get your next assignment.